anxiety, specifically this concept of anxiety as a bucket emotion. So anxiety is very common for those of us in the veterinary profession. And honestly, a lot of us just think it comes with the territory, that stress and anxiety is just all part of being in this profession. And if we didn't believe that coming in, once we've been in it for a while, we definitely believe it moving forward. Along with that, many of us also believe that if we suffer from anxiety, that it's kind of inevitable, that it's not changeable. And many of us actually came into this profession having already been labeled as anxious people, either by ourselves or by somebody that we know. So when we take these things together and then we join it with veterinary medicine and we experience some of the challenges that come along with the profession, our anxiety can get really out of control. And it's a very miserable place to be. Like, nobody loves the way that it feels to be anxious, right? The reason that it's so challenging overall, and that why anxiety feels so overwhelming and like something that's inevitable and that we can't control, is because it's very, I don't want to say complicated, but there's just a lot to it. And so this is where I have kind of thought about this as it being what I consider a bucket emotion. If you ask yourself the question, why are you anxious? Sometimes that's hard to answer, right? And you might come up with a whole lot of things ways that you answer that. If you ask yourself, why are you worried? You might also answer that another way. And what you start to recognize is that when you kind of think in your mind, like, I'm suffering from anxiety, I'm an anxious person, I'm anxious about going to work, you're just defining yourself as that, you actually don't give yourself the space to ask yourself, what are you actually feeling? Well, Carrie, I'm feeling anxious. Well, that's great. I know that, but what does that mean? What does anxiety actually mean? So if you give yourself the space to actually then consider all the different emotions that are lumped into this one bucket that we call anxiety, then what happens is you give yourself the opportunity to look at it objectively and determine why those different emotions are coming up and whether or not there's something there that you can do something about. So it puts you back in control in a way, because instead of just recognizing that you feel bad and labeling that as anxiety, you take that one step further and become curious about what's causing it. Because otherwise, what's the alternative? If we just know that we feel crappy and we label that as anxiety, and for some of us, it's even gone as far as to become like the anxiety attack, which is the physiologic response to all of that. If we don't then question it and investigate it, it does become that inevitable thing that just packs around with us all the time. It's like the bucket that you're carrying all the time. It's this whole bucket of anxiety from all these different things. But we've just labeled it as anxiety and accepted it and carried it, rather than opening it up, dumping it out, and looking at what's really there to see if there are any parts that we can get rid of. Because think about it. If anxiety is a bucket emotion, which is compiled of a whole bunch of different emotions, and you can clean up some of those, the bucket gets lighter. The anxiety feels less overwhelming. So for many of us in vet med, when we think about anxiety, the emotions that are really underneath there are emotions like fear, inadequacy, scarcity, and then along with that, there's one more that is often frustration. Why did I not come up with that one quickly? Frustration. So those are the main ones. And those are not necessarily all of the ones for you. Sadness is also in there often. So a lot of the times it's fear, it's sadness, it's frustration, it's scarcity, and it's inadequacy. And all of those emotions are dancing around inside of this bucket that we're calling anxiety. If we start to realize that we're feeling all of these different emotions, then we can ask ourselves why for each one. And why for each one is a whole lot easier to answer than why are you anxious? Why are you anxious is kind of a big question. It's kind of harder to answer. But if we ask ourselves, okay, I'm feeling anxious, what are the actual emotions? Now, I know, guys, I know trying to tap into these things, these different emotions, can be kind of hard, because it's not like somebody's handed you the emotions dictionary that does actually exist to tell you like which ones of these are you. And so what I'm going to create is basically kind of a list of emotions just as a resource, a free resource. If you want a copy of it, definitely just drop a message here underneath this Facebook Live, and I'll message it to you as soon as I get it done. But the reason I think it's super useful to have this list of emotions is because when you're feeling anxious, you can look at this list and you'll be able to identify what the actual emotion is other than just anxiety. Is it fear? Is it inadequacy? Is it scarcity? Is it sadness? And is it a combination of a lot of things, which it probably will be? Being able to then identify which ones of those emotions are there, then you can ask yourself, why am I feeling afraid? Why am I feeling sad? Why am I feeling inadequate? And those get easier to answer. So why might you be feeling afraid? You might be feeling afraid because you have had a conversation with a client who was angry at the end of it and threatened you, maybe threatened to turn you into the board or something like that. And so you're afraid that that's going to happen. That could be one reason. There are lots of reasons, but that's just one. Why might you be feeling inadequate? So if I'm feeling inadequate, why might I be feeling inadequate? Well, maybe I'm feeling inadequate because that dog spay I just finished took an hour and a half, and it only takes my colleague 20 minutes to do a dog spay. Why might you be feeling frustrated? Maybe you're feeling frustrated because all of a sudden there are 3 extra appointments added on at the end of the day, and now you're believing you're not going to get out of work on time. Why are you feeling sad? Maybe you're feeling sad because one of your favorite patients came in for euthanasia yesterday, and it's still just kind of lingering. And when you look at all of those types of things from that perspective, then you can not only give yourself a little bit of grace, but then you can also question whether or not those underlying beliefs are even something that serve you and that makes sense. So let's just think about the inadequacy one. If you're feeling inadequate because it took you an hour and a half to do a dog spay and it took somebody else only 20 minutes, then what you can recognize is, number one, question, why does that even matter? Because it probably doesn't. Like, if the animal's fine, it doesn't really matter if it's an hour and a half versus 20 minutes. It really doesn't. And if you're a newer veterinarian, you're going to get faster the more that you do. So don't beat yourself up for not, in your beginning, not being equal to somebody else's end or to somebody else's 10 years down the road. Like, we do that all the time. We compare our beginning to somebody else's spot in progress further down the road. So don't do that. And just by allowing yourself to realize that the reason you're feeling inadequate is because of that, then you can also see you're very normal. Like, there's nothing going wrong here. This is all just part of it. And you can give yourself some grace and look at it objectively. In both cases, it was a matter of doing a dog spay, and in both cases, the dog ended up spayed. So in both cases were a success, and the amount of time it took didn't matter. Then when you recognize it from that perspective, that inadequacy starts to go down and the whole anxiety bucket gets a lot lighter. The same thing with the fear.